We're going to start with Richard Peters, and it's been my privilege to get to know Dr. Richard Peters over these past few months as both a co-conspirator and now a co-host for the Summer Institute. Georgetown University's president, Jack DeGioia, speaks about the need to work at the intersection of scholarship, the common good, and student formation if we're to achieve our educational goals. And Richard embodies this ethos. His scholarly interests in corporate social responsibility align with his work with colleagues, organizations, and students on issues related to social responsibility and sustainability. And now in his role as Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Xavier University of Louisiana, Richard's taken on a leadership role in student formation with work focused on the core curriculum. I'm honored to consider him a new colleague and a friend. Richard, welcome.
Heidi, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's joining us. I know one of the things that has been difficult for us as a team is kind of deciding which sessions to go to. And I actually said, rather coyly, but there was some truth that there were a couple of other sessions that I kind of wish I was able to attend. And I mentioned to my colleague, Nate Holmes, that I might just drop by. And he said, "You can't do that. You're presenting." I said, I have multiple Zoom accounts, but also I'm grateful that we're recording, but I hope that I know we will have a great session. Christina's an amazing person and in this space, and she'll have a lot to say. I was really kind of thinking about this and how to address this question. And I will kind of qualify my remarks in the beginning by saying that I am in no way, shape, or form, I will consider myself an expert to answer this question. And so perhaps I'm going to leave you with more questions or more concerns than I necessarily address. But I will say that I have always been, or at least for the last 10 to 15 years, been really interested in this question of how we tie these experiences together or create this holistic experience, as we say. I will say that I didn't grow up in the United States. I grew up in Trinidad. My university education before coming to the United States, I didn't have any idea what co-curriculum meant or extracurricular meant, and I definitely didn't know what a liberal arts education was. And so when I came to the United States and I became invested, and now I work at Xavier University, an HBCU, a proud HBCU, liberal arts education, historically Black university, Catholic university. I really took on the mantle of understanding and appreciating the benefits of education, and also finding ways in my classroom, as well as now as director of the core curriculum and as the associate dean, of how best we can leverage this to create the type of Xavierites, as we call them at our institution, the type of global leaders, change makers that we wanted to. And as I was looking at this question, the thing that I kind of came back to, and this is, I will be honest, this position, if you will, in my head has been influenced to some degree over the last few days. I don't think it came about that, but it definitely kind of reinforced some of my thoughts. I'm thinking about a session that I attended yesterday, which were a panelist. There was actually an old friend of mine, Brian Dewsbury, and Brian was talking about this, this need to really change the way that we see the work that we do in the classroom, right? And instead of being these content providers, that we really have to see ourselves as cliched as it perhaps sounds, as helping our students become these types of leaders. And so to me, that really sparked this question that I had, and what I believe is my, and this is kind of my, if you will, my general theme here, in that the problem or the major challenge, the fact that we're even speaking about this, the need to tie these things together, stems from that little prefix, if you will, in front of that second word, right? So we're talking about curriculum, and then we have co-curriculum. And those two little, those letters CO, I think, have made a significant or created a significant obstacle. I think there is a reasoning there, of course, why we have separated those two. There is some kind of instrumental and functional benefit to that. But I think that unfortunately, it has created some division and some dominance, as well as some significant, if you will, disparity. And the reality is, and no matter how much we try to kind of cloak it or try to not speak or speak around it, is that oftentimes what I've seen is that co-curricular, when we talk about these types of activities that we all agree are important and significant in the well-being of a student, they oftentimes are deemed relatively subordinate to the other things, to the classroom, to the work, right? The importance, why you've come to the institution. And why I say this is because when I look at how we've approached this at our institution, I'm going to try to be as transparent as I can, is that oftentimes we're coming from the perspective of we've crafted the academic experience, and now we're trying to find ways to perhaps enhance, differentiate, allow our students these kinds of additional opportunities. But we're coming from it from the basis of we have already crafted it. And so because we have already crafted it, we're now trying to engage entities, organizations, and even students into our preconceived plan. And the ways that we go about doing this are often through co-option, coercion, even trying to convince, right? It happens from the administration to faculty, from faculty to student affairs and student services, and even from the institution to students. We're all just trying to figure out a way to fit our co-curricular activities into our designed academic approaches. And the reality is that in and of itself, that approach in and of itself, I believe, cannot lead to the sustainable success that we want to see from this. And I think that has become, at least it should have become extremely evident to all of us during the pandemic and now post-pandemic. And the reason I say that is because what we've realized and what students have been communicating to us is that the university has to be more than a content provider. If it's all about us sharing knowledge, just telling you what you need to know, then let's be real honest. There's no real need for you to be on my campus. There's no real need, honestly, for you to even be in my classroom. I mean, I teach business, right? I teach strategy. My students, myself, I can go listen to lectures by the best strategists out there. Not just people in academia, but people all over the world, people that are running corporations. And yeah, while I may tell myself, and maybe some of my students may say, I have a certain nuanced approach to doing it that makes my services relatively valuable. Beyond just that content provision, I have to do more, right? We have to do more. And so that co-curricular activity becomes that more. But as I mentioned before, if it's simply a way for us to dress or to put the frosting on our created cake, then I don't think we're going to see much benefit. And we're going to continue to have these discussions about how do we bring this together. So again, my argument is largely the fact that we've separated, we've divided, we've created a division between these experiences, have led us now to these discussions of how can we bring it together. And I will say this, that there are, and I've done a little bit of research. I think Khristina is going to speak much to this. There are institutions that are doing this better than we are, doing this well even. But still in those organizations, and I should probably just speak more about us. when we try to address our challenges, I think we've even fallen short. And let me explain what I mean by that. So I'll use some examples. I'll try to be as transparent as possible without sharing too much. But I want to kind of give you an example of where I see we've to some degree fallen. So we had a situation, we had a project where we were introducing a career pathway to our freshman students. And in order for us to do this, we were using our first year experience course. And so, the first year we did this, I won't go into a ton of details of kind of what the setup was. But the first year we do this, we had a lot of pushback from our faculty. Faculty were saying, listen, we feel kind of disengaged in this process. Our students are asking us questions we're not sure about. We feel like this is kind of what I was saying. This is something that's more so an add-on than a part of the class. And we said, okay, we hear you. We understand where you're coming from. So the way that we're going to solve that problem, if you will, is through better and more consistent communication. So we're going to tell you in advance what the schedule is. We're going to let you know what the students are expected to do. We're going to actually, work with you to figure out when it is we can kind of come to your classes, right? And I will say that there was improvement, there was less resistance, but I will tell you what we didn't necessarily get. We didn't get buy-in. And the reason I believe that we didn't get buy-in there is because faculty were much more informed, but we still feel separate from this process, i.e., we feel like you're kind of trying to co-opt us. You've created this thing, and we say, no, we're not trying to co-opt you. No, we're more so trying to convince you. But again, going back to the problem here is that faculty was never really invested in this. But we thought they would be. We thought that they would see this benefit in doing this. So as students were being given this evaluation, and they were being assessed, and we could kind of get an idea of where their leanings were, and that kind of put them into the position to start their professional development. So they were starting to think about careers. And we're like, why would faculty not want this? And it wasn't necessarily such a thing that faculty didn't want it, but they weren't part of the process at all. And so the communication did help. Similarly with our students were, okay, I know of the program, I kind of know about the program, but I'm still not certain why. And so what we realized there was that while communication helped, what we really potentially needed to do was to have more conversations. We needed to actually sit, and you all know this, there's a difference, right? I heard this in a session before, and it really, really stuck with me. There's a young lady, and I think it was on the first day, and she was saying, somebody asked, I can't remember what the prompt was, but she answered it this way. She said, and I'm paraphrasing. She said, you know what students don't like? Students don't like when you ask their opinion and then you don't use it, right? Like, none of us like that. Like, okay, we're hearing you. We request your communication, but we're not actually having a dialogue. We're not having a conversation. And so for me, that's where and it goes back to that separation again. We believe that by communicating to each other, by informing each other of what we're doing separately, that we've somehow brought ourselves together. And we haven't, because I still don't know, not necessarily what you do, but why what you do matters or should matter to me, and vice versa. So we still have that separation because faculty are not necessarily talking to career services, and career services aren't really talking to faculty. And guess who's the conduit? The student. But the student is as confused because they're not certain what master to follow, right? Should I, is it this? Is it that? How that we know when we're part of something that doesn't necessarily isn't coming together. And so there, where is that? So we tried to fix it with communication. And here we are recognizing that what we really needed to do was have some conversation. The other issue that kind of has come about is, and this again, how we solve it is we have these moving parts, right? And that's one of the things you hear about in terms of bringing curricula and co-curricular, all of these moving parts. So what do we need to do? We need to coordinate. We need to have some way of kind of getting the moving parts to work together. And I'll give you another example. So we just designed a first year, first gen program for our quality enhancement plan. And when we were doing this, there were 4 aspects of the plan. And what we first envisioned was we were going to have people in each one of these. So let's kind of think about it. I actually saw some examples that were very similar to that during these days. In fact, you had a student, and the student had these 4, if you want to call them coaches, right? And we said, what we need to do is we need to coordinate that. We need to find a way to have this student kind of interact and engage with these 4 coaches. Now, I remember my provost coming to me and saying, do you honestly think that a student's going to have time to meet with 4 coaches, right? And I was like, no, but it sounded good in my head. But then secondly, what we were doing there was essentially, again, keeping these 4 entities apart. We were almost partitioning this student into, okay, you've got to do career services, then you've got to do your academic advising, then you have the student engagement piece, then we're going to concern ourselves with your resilience. And yes, while we do have components and aspects of ourselves, the reality is the reason why we included all of those things into one program is because they all work together. So a student was not going to succeed in class if they were stressed over their financial aid. And similarly, if a student was working in a class and the class had relevance to the project or the internship that they were trying to get, there's some investment. But when they're all separated, understand this, they're well coordinated, right? Everything's flowing as it should, but nothing's coming together. Nothing's coming together because we believe that somehow there's going to be that aha, it's all going to organically, and it doesn't, because there's really no cooperation there. There's no cooperation. And so if you use the example again of that career pathways, we did a better job of coordinating that the second year. There was a better flow. I would even argue there was better fluency, but there wasn't any cooperation because it was still kept apart. Faculty weren't asking career services, hey, what do you do that can actually help me do what I do in my class? Because what faculty realize, and we realize this, we're terrible at providing career service. We're terrible at it, right? We don't do a very good job. Neither do we do a good job in terms of resilience, most of us. But their aspects, their agencies, their entities in our university that do. But it's not just simply as a support to our class, but also as potentially a component of our class. And so that coordination that we thought, okay, we'd fix it by just managing this better, it didn't help us. It didn't help us. And so because we weren't working together. We still weren't working together. The other thing that I see, and I'll be honest, I'll put my hand up and say I am guilty of this, is instead of us trying to, what I would say, compose, we oftentimes are more concerned with compromise. And so I'll give you an example. We had, when we created our core curriculum, we created these new sets of courses. They were actually called the Xavier Experience and the New Orleans Experience. And they were supposed to be courses that were new, innovative, that either focused on our mission as social justice, humanity, and equity, or looked at some particular unique aspect of our region or our city. And while it wasn't explicit in terms of the demand of the class, the description of the class, or the construction of the conceptualization of the class lent itself heavily to service learning. And what we found was, and the reason why we did that, and we didn't make it mandatory, was this class was kind of replacing our old first year experience. And the old first year experience, in the first semester, students kind of did what we now still do as college experience, time management, learn about your university, how do you get advised, those kinds of things, general skill sets, if you will. And in that second semester, it was supposed to be much more about living the mission, service engagement, looking at social justice topics and things like that. And we wanted to make the second semester very similar to that, but we didn't want to make it mandatory to service learning because, to be quite honest, our service learning experiences did not live up to our expectation. That's true, and for some of the reasons I kind of already mentioned. But it creates, so we allow for this. What we've seen, however, is that the majority of classes that have been created, and I'll just be honest because I oversee these classes, they yearn for service learning. But in most cases, if faculty choose service learning, they do it as an add-on. So they've constructed their class, they've built the components, and then they kind of say, okay, how can I support what I'm teaching with some service learning? And I've argued for a totally different approach. How about we start this? Consider how you can build this class, not necessarily around service learning, but with a partner, with an issue, with a challenge, and then develop content to support that. And so, but that's just different. And again, as faculty, that's not necessarily where we are, and that's not our strong suits. And so we try to find ways to kind of see how it can support. What do we do well? We teach content, we teach theory. So while I'm talking about creolization, or I'm talking about homelessness in New Orleans, or I'm talking about literacy, I'm going to talk about it still theoretically, and I'm going to find ways for students maybe to kind of get a little bit of taste of what this means in the real world. So that composition versus the compromise. And then for me, the last thing that I've seen is just how these two aspects of a student's experience literally compete with each other. And so for our students, and I don't know if that's a true, because hopefully we'll have some question or an opportunity to hear from the audience, is that with our students, the reality is this: they're coming to Xavier with one purpose. They want that degree. They want to succeed, because that degree for many of our students is life-changing, life-changing. Their entire families have invested, their communities have literally invested in these students. And so for us to say to them, hey, listen, we understand, we appreciate what you're doing, you're coming here, you're getting this degree, you're doing these classes, but what about these things? We have to demonstrate to them the return. We have to show them that this is not simply just things that you do to fill your time. But what we've seen here, again, because of that disconnect, is that a student is literally having to choose. They're having to choose. If I do this, then I can't do this. If I'm, if I get involved in this, then I can't do that, because there's no budget. There's no movement, and especially I'll say movement is more so from our side, in that we're not changing the way we're teaching. We're not seeing this as a complement to what we're doing. And so because of that, and I go back to what Brian said yesterday, when yes, of course, as a professor, an instructor, you want your students to understand and appreciate fact, but at the end of the day, let's be honest, they're going to get those facts. It goes kind of back to what I said before, content provision. They're going to get it. But if I'm so consumed with making sure they get it because I have to provide it and I have to provide it in that way, then I'm not going to decrease. If anything has to happen, it has to happen along with what I'm doing. And so that competitiveness between the co-curricula and the curricula is going to force students to make decisions. And let's be honest, the decisions are going to be one that isn't in favor of the co-curricular, because it is not something that traditionally students have seen, or our students have seen value in. And it is not something that as an institution, although we have it, although we try to promote it, that we prioritize. So again, for me, as I said, kind of at the beginning of the qualifier, I don't have answers. What I can tell you is that what we've tried to do in terms of our management, in terms of our incremental, even operational approaches, have allowed us some success. But in my opinion, we have still not been able to integrate. It is still separate, and I don't see any way to rectify that without removing that label. So as again, I mentioned Brian too many times, but as he said yesterday, if we can get to the point where you don't have a social justice curriculum, you just have a curriculum, then I think we've done what we're supposed to. If we can just be talking about curriculum and it involves all of these things that we are now talking about in terms of co-curriculum, then maybe we've achieved what we intended to do. So that's what I have.
So, it's my pleasure right now to welcome Khristina back to the Summer Institute. Dr. Gonzalez led the Princeton team at the first iteration of the Institute back in 2019. And it was clear at that moment in time that we erred by not asking her to speak. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to rectify that oversight. And Khristina is the Senior Associate Dean of the college and the Bob Peck Class of '88, Director of the Emma Bloomberg Center for Access and Opportunity at Princeton University. I've been at Georgetown for 22 years and I'm now fully a Hoya, but Princeton is my alma mater. And I take great pride in watching from afar the astonishing leadership that Khristina has shown in its equity space. Like Richard, her scholarly work on social reform, as seen through the lens of 19th century literature, seems to have predicted a career dedicated to enacting social reform, this time in higher education. Now, her leadership within the office of the Dean of the College supports and advances Princeton's commitment to an inclusive undergraduate student body. I'm so grateful that she's joined us today to share her wisdom. Khristina, welcome.
Heidi, and I wore Princeton orange for you today. So, and I have to say, my participation in the 2019 Institute was created the birth of a brand new math intro math curriculum, right, to try to figure out how to better place students. And I will say it was one of the best interactions that I've ever seen between the kind of curricular advising team, administration, and the faculty from the math department. And it really revamped the entire way that students experience placement at Princeton. So I can't thank you enough for that opportunity. And I hope folks get the same kind of, we really took a lot of joy in having those kinds of conversations, when we were there last time. So I hope that other folks are having that same experience this time. So I will share my screen. I'm really grateful to how Richard started us out, mostly because it really dovetails with some of the things that I wanted to share today. I have slides mostly because I wanted to kind of show you a few graphics. Let's see, can folks see this? Are we good? Okay, awesome. And I'm going to ask you first, I want you to have a reaction, right? So I'm going to show you a slide and I want you to react to it in the chat, right? There's no right answer to this slide. All right, so this is a map of the undergraduate advising ecosystem at Princeton. So just write a word. If you're a faculty member, you're a student, you're a staff, whatever it is, put a word in the chat. Tell me how it makes you feel, just first glance. Yeah, panic, overwhelming, big, yeah, confusing. I'm tired as well. It's very tiring, sometimes overwhelmed. Yeah, okay. So, and we created this graphic to lend a sense of clarity to, this is a brand new graphic. We just got here like last year, right? We were like, nobody understands how this whole thing works, right? So we just made this graphic. Now it has links. It's really, we show it to students. We try to walk them through it. It's great, but it also really demonstrates the fact that A, we need this graphic, B, the graphic is still really confusing, and C, the way that the whole thing is kind of positioned, I think really speaks to what Richard was talking about, right? So somewhere in here you have the student, presumably like kind of right in the middle of the residential college advising team, but you can see the way that the perspective of that student, right, or on that student from these different angles, everybody gets one slice of who this kid is, right? Everybody's interacting with them from one particular angle. Nobody ever really sees the whole student. And I think what Richard said was really important, which is that we see, we often see students from these angles, and so we miss the fact that they're humans, right? So I think the thing that I want to kind of put on the table is that it's not that co-curricular experiences, we need to figure out how to integrate them. I mean, I think that's true, but more that we need to figure out how to acknowledge the fact that if we do not deal with the co-curricular, with the human, right, element of teaching, of education, it is impossible for our students to have academic success. So that's the kind of provocation in the terms of this institute that I'll put on the table, which I love so much. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of context about Princeton and how we're kind of thinking about this. So a lot of you guys have probably seen some of this, but we are at a moment at Princeton where we're experiencing what our president has called the greatest transformation of Princeton's undergraduate student body since coeducation, which is pretty radical, right? And what that means from where we sit is that the percentage of Pell Grant students, of first generation low income students, has radically shifted from about 15 years ago to where we are now. So we are at now about 22% of our overall population is Pell eligible. That is only one segment of our first generation lower income population. We do holistic review in my office every year of all of the incoming students, and we reread all of their applications after they've been admitted. And what we're really looking at with that holistic review is about between 25 and 30% of our students identify as first generation and or lower income students, right? So it's big, 1/4 of our students are in this population. Historically, in case you didn't know, that is not the population that Princeton has served, right? We are well known, I think, for our exclusivity. There are a lot of, I think, assumptions about what Princeton is. I'm here to tell you that that is changing, but it does not, our history was not this. There have been a significant amount of policies on the access side that have led to this, right? So we have a no loan financial aid package. We have full need for international students, right? That those kind of fundamental financial aid policies. We really think about in 2006, I just want to share this one element of the timeline. We have these things called eating clubs on campus, which are like fancier versions of frats, right? Where meals are kind of served to students, and a lot of students dine in those spaces, right? Apart from the residential colleges. They are expensive to join. So until 2006, there was a big gap between students who could afford to be a part of those eating clubs and those who couldn't, right? Which meant that membership was really skewed to our higher income students. So in 2006, we readjusted some financial aid to ensure that any student who wanted to eat at a dining hall and thus be a member could do that and have that as part of their financial aid policy. The reason that I bring this up is because it's really the first time that I think we started considering like what equity of experience was rather than just access, right? What does it mean once you get here? This has been a common thread, over the last couple of years, even before the pandemic, this kind of move. And I think Heidi, you were talking about this in the introduction, when we start thinking about success rather than just access, when we start thinking about opportunity, right? Equity of opportunity, right? So let's think about it from that lens. And this is not, this is not new. And I know a lot of you in the audience are probably, scholars in this field, but we do know we have a lot of work that's already been done on what the differences are for our first generation lower income students, our underrepresented students in their experience, right? We know that they kind of fall on three major axis points, right? Cultural capital. So students coming, they may not understand the learning environments that they're in, right? If you've already gone to Andover and you've been in a Harkness table seminar environment. You know what that's like, right? And some of our students are coming from, places where education was much more rote memorization. That's the kind of K through 12 education they have. Using resources, right? What is a writing center? I directed the writing center at Princeton before I was in this role. I went to Dartmouth as an undergrad, never once used the writing center. I didn't even know it existed, right? I just had no knowledge of that. So using those resources, thinking about different professional and social networks, right? I would say 85% of our first gen low income students come in saying they're going to be a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer. Those are the things that everybody knows about, right? So, and those are the kind of career paths that are available to them. They just have different kinds of understanding of different professional networks. Then we have material resource gaps. Those are cost of living, food insecurity, having college credits that you're bringing in with you. You may have financial precarity at home. Students are sending money home to support their family members. And then, of course, the kind of just larger sense of belonging, right? Belonging, uncertainty, visibility of other people that are like you on campus, familiarity with your family with this kind of environment, and so the support that you might get. The reason that I want to show this slide is because, as you can see, none of these are exclusively academic and or co-curricular differences, right, or experiences. They span both of those things, right? And so when we think about the programs that we build, and here's our advising network again, you can see one of the problems is that those are kind of split between co-curricular and academic spaces, right? I'm on the academic side, I'm on the dean of the college side. That is the academic space. We have a whole campus life side of the house, right? Like many of you. Everybody's job is kind of located in one of these places or another, but we know that the actual lived experience, the crucial components of that, span both of those things. So this is a kind of structural problem, right? So we need to think about what our interventions look like along these kinds of more theoretical angles rather than along the kind of institutional structures that we've been considering. So the interventions need to fall within how do we think about cultural capital, both in the classroom, right? And in the professional networks. We need to think about sense of belonging, again, in how study groups are formed. We know that certain students are excluded from study groups. That's an academic issue, but we also know that it's a harder road to having a membership in a certain club if other people from your high school didn't go to that club, right? So sense of belonging is also academic and co-curricular. So we're thinking about the interventions in both of those ways. The other thing I would say is that they have to be both structural policy-wise, and they have to be programmatic. And I want that to be another kind of, so if we're thinking about academic and co-curricular, we also want to think about these kinds of policy initiatives and programming initiatives. Those two things have to go hand in hand with one another. So these are the kinds of some examples of the policy side. And I know a lot of places are now thinking about FLI students and thinking, well, what are the policies that we can enact that are special for FLI students? We'll give them more money in their financial aid offer. We'll do special funds for them. The problem with a lot of these initiatives is that it creates these kinds of cliffs for students who are just at the financial aid line between maybe, fully funded versus family contribution of like $1,000, right? So what we really want to think about is like, what is equitable policy for all students, right? So think about things like room and board, right? Making sure that that it's all funded. Professional development opportunities. If you have a professional development opportunity at Princeton, if you're running an internship or research experience, you have to fund the student at a certain minimum. You can't be running those programs and not have funding for that. Thinking about health and wellness, right? Having special funds available for students who have ongoing chronic illnesses, who need to see specialists in a particular area. Things like academic equity, right? Making sure that the tutoring is always free. We have a policy at Princeton where it is actually against the rules, rights, rules, and responsibilities to get external tutoring, right? Because what that does is creates an unfair advantage for students who have the funding to be able to go external to the university. So how do you make sure that all of that is located in-house? And then we have specific programs, right, that are designed to support specific populations. Some of these include, and I can share this more with interested folks later, but just quickly, we have our summer on-ramp program. It's 8 weeks. It's actually starting today, which is really exciting. We have about 160 students who are coming through that program. They get course credit. We have different FLI identity programming, so making sure that students are recognized for the fullness of their identities, right? When we start talking about, well, what do we do, to support fly students? That question in and of itself is kind of moot, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense because fly students have multiple identities as well, and they're very different from one another, right? So we can't think about this as a flat population. One of the programs that I want to specifically show you is the Scholars Institute Fellows Program. So this is our 4-year Scholars Program. We started in 2015. We had 40 students. This past year, during the pandemic, when it was all virtual, we had 450 students sign up. So they choose to do this program, right? There's no, they get an invitation. There's no real, financial incentive. It's not part of a scholarship program. It's purely choice. So we're really proud of the scale numbers because it means that students want to be participating. And the reason I think is because the program is intended to help them make sense of their experience, right? So we have mentorship groups weekly as part of this. They meet with upperclassmen. Those upperclassmen meet with graduate students. They meet with faculty members. So everybody's getting some kind of mentorship down the line, right? In addition, we have what we call the HELP system. You get it? Like, help. It's called HALP, right? And what this stands for is health and wellness, academic enrichment, life skills, and professional development. This is kind of what we consider the hidden curriculum, right? And so we provide students with the map of all of the things that are happening on campus. We go to different departments, different areas and say, what have you got going on? And we code them for students. So if they're going to a career services event, we would code that as professional development. Maybe there's a financial literacy workshop through financial aid. We code that as life skills. We tell them you need to make help every semester, get help by going to a certain number of these workshops. And what that does is really just visualize for them how to navigate these different spaces. By doing that, students then get certain benefits. And this is where I think, again, the academic and the co-curricular are combined because they see these benefits. We have academic opportunities like what we call novice precepts. So in things like chemistry and math, students who are new learners, right, who maybe didn't have an AP course or didn't have a lot of training in this, get to take a precept together to kind of lessen the anxiety about maybe asking a question, right, something like that. The idea is that you do these things, these commitments, you learn how to navigate the institution, and then you get to be a part of these other opportunities as well, right? So it really helps students kind of form an understanding of how the institution works. This is just some of the data that we have about academic behaviors, right? So this is how we can see this benefiting our students. So our students who go through our programs, in particular this one, FSI, much more likely to be having conversations with faculty member, much more likely to participate in a study group. And this is what we want to see. We want to see engagement, not just in academics, right? We want to see a kind of dedicated engagement, a kind of self-efficacy across the university. So that's the goal of all of our programs. And then I love the student. I swear I did not pay the student to write this review of his experience. But he's talking about coming to Princeton and the assumption that he was making. And what he did after participating, he said he realized that the academics were not only bearable, but that there are a myriad of opportunities for support. And then he goes on to say that, I learned that Princeton is home to many students like myself. This created a sense of community, understanding between myself and my peers. I no longer viewed myself as unfit and out of place. Rather, I realized that I belonged in this community, right? So again, we see the student articulating, hey, there's this academic component to my life. There's this personal component, the social co-curricular component, and both of those things are equally important to me. One of the things that is really important, I think, about having specialized programs like SIFP or this kind of integrated advising model for students is that they really do benefit the institution. And I think this is where some of the things that Richard was saying, again, are really important. We have what we call a telephone operator model. We don't do specific programming for our office is not an expert in career development. We're not an expert in science learning. We have those experts on campus. So our job is to try to figure out how to channel students into those resources so that those in those different offices can say, yeah, actually, when we look at our data, we have proportionate resource use from all different kinds of students, which is a big question for a lot of offices. We also want to help students make sense of the university. A lot of times when we see students becoming frustrated with us and saying, none of these things make any sense, that's when we see a kind of antagonism be created. And I think this, Richard, this is what you're getting at, between students and administrators and faculty, because they don't understand how anything functions, right? Because we never told them any of this stuff. So we need to give them, we need to empower them by giving them the information that we have about how the institution functions. And that only can happen if we ourselves understand it. The other, another part is consulting role with other offices. So thinking about how, rather than creating more and more more and more specific workshops or resources for students, again, we're looking back out into the offices that already exist. So saying, career services, hey, we got this feedback from a student. They're not really sure, I don't know, they didn't know that all of the finance jobs actually came available three years before you actually got the job, right? Because now finance recruits in when kids are in kindergarten, which is a whole other set of concerns. But maybe our FLY students don't know that. So could you do a workshop earlier, freshman year, for our students, right? So really helping offices adjust to the needs of a changing population. Creating these positive microclimates, right? Having somebody on the ground who can say to a student, oh yeah, like maybe you didn't, I hear you, right? That faculty member, maybe they didn't quite make clear what their office hours were for, or, this is, having somebody who a student can come and say, I got this feedback from an instructor, I'm not really sure what it means. How do I approach them? How do I write them an email, right? Those kinds of positive microclimates will allow for increased student engagement and positive experience in the institution, which will benefit everybody down the line when we all know that we're looking to our students as well for post-graduation involvement and future donations, right? The other thing I think is immediate recognition of trends. There's a lot of talk about data now. It's super important, we know that, but data has different forms. And one of the forms of data is anecdotal experience and trend recognition. If you don't have people on the ground who can be responsive to students' needs, who see what's going on and can then go up the chain and say, hey, these are the policy revisions that we need to make, all of the surveys in the world are not going to do you any good if you don't have a kind of textured understanding of what the student experience looks like. And then again, questions about community and cohort building, right? That kind of recruitment and visibility. So I just kind of want to show you before I wrap up some of the changes that we did during COVID and some of the institutionalization that came from that. So, as you know, COVID didn't necessarily create all of the problems that we are now facing, but rather made those things visible, right? So if you've been in this work of equity for a long time, these are problems, these disparities have existed for a long time. It's shown a brighter light on those things, right? One of the things that I wanted to kind of bring up here is that the challenges that our students faced academically, when you look at the heart of these challenges, they are not academic challenges, right? So our faculty did this survey, which I think was really interesting, right? That surveyed students, it was a STEM retention survey. So surveyed students enrolled in STEM courses last year. The hypothesis, like everybody thought, like, okay, has something to do with performance is going to be tied to access to labs. You don't have access to labs, you don't have access to equipment, that's going to be your problem, right? You don't have access to tech, right? That was not at all the correlation that we found. The correlation that the faculty found was that academic experience was most closely correlated, negative academic experience was most closely correlated with caretaking obligations at home, increased anxiety and concern for relatives with pre-existing conditions or those who were essential workers, right? So if you had a family member who was going to work outside of the home, there was a greater correlation with worries about your academic performance. And then access to study spaces. So if you were in a room with 5 siblings and you didn't have a quiet place to do your work, that also had correlation. These survey results correspond, I think really closely to any of us who were on the ground last year who were seeing these concerns from students come up. But again, this is why you cannot separate the co-curricular and the personal experience from the academic experience, because like, I mean, that's my kind of thesis, right? Without recognizing the human, without dealing with those needs, you cannot have an academic experience at all. So these are just a few of the things that we changed during the crisis. And this is a kind of never let a good crisis go to waste slide. But these were some of the emergency measures that we took, thinking about making sure that we had emergency residency policies for students during the pandemic so they could stay even though the dorms were closed. And now from that, we have a new continuous housing policy where students can apply and basically say, Princeton's my home, I don't go anywhere else. The dorms cannot be closed for break because otherwise I'm going to be homeless, right? So we have that policy now. Emergency funding, so assisting with emergency situations, with storage. Now those funds are going to be institutionalized and make sure that students have access to funding over break periods as well. Family and community experiences, our PACE Center for social justice and outreach created what we called RISE grants during the George Floyd situation last June, created these grants so that students could activate in their home communities, right, and do that social justice work, also in response to the pandemic, right? So if they saw inequities on the ground, they had some funding to be able to resolve them in their home communities. That's a really important connection for students to be able to make, right? Because that allows them to address some of those issues that are happening at home. The thing that I think is one of the most important initiatives that we started was thinking about how we could have a dedicated social worker. And I know Georgetown, you guys have something that's similar to this, but for first-gen low-income students, for students who are going to be taking leave, who have family who are navigating eviction or health concerns or other things of their own, our institutional resources, right, extend to the student. That is, that is our unit of service. The student, again, does not exist in a singular vacuum, right? They are in a community. And so the question for our institutions is like, well, what do we do to address the fact that students' academic needs are deeply tied into their community needs? So we have a social worker on staff now whose job it is to connect students with external resources, not just for them, but for their family members who, in addressing those needs, then the student can focus on their own experience at the institution. So that's kind of where we are as an institution. This is just a slide to kind of wrap up, I think, and to point to the ways that some of the virtual engagement can kind of help with some of this. So I would say, that belonging, that cultivating belonging requires institutional equity, right? It requires this policy, but it ultimately is facilitated through relationships, right? And so we need to think about the ways that we are making our institutional structures visible to students and giving them the knowledge that they need for self-advocacy. In turn, the relationships that we foster with students on the ground facilitate institutional equity. So the beauty, I think, one of the very rare things about my role is that I have basically equal time at policy tables and talking to students about, I don't know, what they had for breakfast that morning, or doing a running group with them, or, running a cooking class, right? I have equal time with those two things. And that allows me to provide other forms of data besides these kind of like big data measurements and say, yeah, I see this trend coming. You're not even going to know to measure for that trend, but you need to address it right now before it becomes an issue. And then I would say that these new virtual spaces, so this is a shot from our Discord server that we use with our students, that these new virtual spaces can facilitate some of these relationships because it allows for rapid communication and scale of those relationships, and kind of can increase accessibility of those of different staff members, faculty members, and lessen intimidation. So it's a lot easier for a student to say, I'm just going to send you a DM because I have no idea what's happening in chemistry class, or should I take this class, than it is to make an appointment to come into the office. So I think at the same time that we want to be wary of what we've lost during virtual life, we also want to think about what can be gained from it. So that is what I have for you today, and I'm happy to answer questions, and very grateful to be here with all of you.